Katie, beautiful Katie, you're the only girl that I adore. When the moon shines over the cowshed, I'll be waiting at the kitchen door. Katie, beautiful Katie, you're the only girl that I adore. When the moon shines over the cowshed, I'll be waiting at the kitchen door.
To many of us now, 1914 seems a simple time in the calm, uncomplicated past. Unbothered by foreign affairs and deeply involved in social and political reform, America was comfortable in isolation and growing in its own moral confidence. Even the most provincial communities were not immune to ideals of growth and progress. In just a few years, Saturday evening had become the time when every young man took his girl to the movies. After a decade in which screen stories lasted only 10 minutes each, new feature films were expanding movies' potential and their appeal to audiences across the nation. Few of these pictures had any great sophistication, but the nation didn't seem to mind. America's mad love affair with the movies was underway. Virtue almost always triumphed. Mustang Charlie and his straight-shooting girl emerged victorious, if somewhat bruised. Outside the White House, a placid scene in deep summer shadow. While inside, President Woodrow Wilson seemed the perfect embodiment of a peaceful country, convinced of its own strength and virtue. Elected in 1912, Wilson pledged that America was to become the moral leader among nations. But our country's insularity would soon be challenged, and Wilson's ideals put to a test few could have predicted in 1914. Dark events in Europe would soon shock the nation out of its simple self-image. And American films, too, would reflect the first great international upheaval of the 20th century. A new day was about to dawn, and movies would begin to grapple with the issues of the times. This innocent off-screen kiss between Mae Marsh and Robert Herron would be replaced by harsher realities. In July and August of 1914, declarations of war were exchanged between the Central Powers of Germany, Austria, and Hungary, and the allies of Western and Southern Europe and Russia. By November, Germany had overrun neutral Belgium, opening a troop corridor to France. Belgian civilians offered violent resistance, and the German recriminations that followed became a major propaganda issue. President Wilson immediately declared America's neutrality, and our nation rejoiced in its isolation from old world lunacy. Movie audiences were reminded of our neutral position with slides flashed on the screen. But fascination with the war was growing. America has always been a nation of mechanics and tinkerers, and the public was intrigued with the machinery of the new warfare. Movie newsreels obliged with every innovation they could show. The masters of the machines became the new heroes. Moviegoers were well acquainted with the great flying aces, such as the Frenchman René Fonck and German pilots like the Red Baron von Richthofen Center and Wilhelm Belke at Wright. As demand grew at the box office, film stories turned from Civil War battlefields of The Birth of a Nation to the Europe of Thomas Ince's film Civilization. While preaching peace, the new feature films reveled in war. Actors fought raging battles on vague European fronts and died in foreign trenches. Unnamed enemies wearing familiar spiked helmets herded women and children through ruined streets. The figure of Christ himself was brought forward by producer Ince to convey the inhumanity of war. The Prince of Peace leads the king of a warring nation onto a battlefield to see firsthand the ravages he has called forth. This pacifist film is often credited with helping to re-elect Wilson in 1916 on a platform of neutrality. The epic Intolerance was a plea for universal brotherhood by the great pioneer film director D.W. Griffith. It too opened in 1916. Intolerance contains more violence and despair than any earlier film. Yet it ends with heavenly hosts bringing peace to a battlefield and a utopian community of love reigning on earth. But pleas for peace and tolerance among men could hardly compete with the new national obsession, the submarine. The captain of this one, in Civilization, imagines he is sinking a passenger liner. To prevent the foul deed, sinks instead his own submarine. The Lusitania incident had occurred only 1 year before this film was released, and through scenes like these, audiences enjoyed taking fictional revenge on murderous submarine commanders. By 1916, German submarines were devastating French and British shipping. This brutal effectiveness captured the imagination of Americans. Domestic newsreels brought the submarines to America's doorstep. They were shown cruising off the Atlantic coast and refueling in American ports. In an uneasy circus atmosphere, officials of Newport News, Virginia, turned out to inspect the submarines and have their pictures taken with the captains. Fiction films having little or nothing to do with the war also helped satisfy public curiosity about the submarine. In the first episode of this serial, the sighting of a submarine from a passenger liner causes mass terror and pandemonium. The supposed enemy remained unnamed, but audiences never doubted it was Germany. For the lucky people on this ship, the submarine turned out to be American. But the scene brought to mind that there was no last-minute rescue for those who had perished on the hundreds of ships that were sent to the bottom. The submarine scare was no mere fiction or mass hysteria manufactured by newspapers and movies. A German U-boat commander, who was also an amateur movie maker, kept a personal record of his sinking, and in the logs of the U-35, people in their local theaters saw the terrifying reality of submarine warfare. One more ship is sent to the bottom and is duly crossed off the commander's list. Moviegoers who saw these and other similar newsreels could not leave the theater without remembering these grim images. May 1915, the British Cunard liner, the Lusitania, sailed from New York and was sunk by a German submarine with the loss of 128 American lives. In fact, it is now known that the Lusitania was carrying contraband munitions to Great Britain. Germany had placed a notice in the New York Times warning Americans to stay off the ship. Still, the event was considered an outrage. It marked a major turning point in American public opinion. Cartoonist Winsor McCay captured this attitude in his early animated film, The Sinking of the Lusitania. title of this film says, the man who fired the shot was decorated for it by the Kaiser, and yet they tell us not to hate the Hun. In America, a growing movement advocated arming for the possibility of war. Outspoken for preparedness was former President Theodore Roosevelt, who called President Wilson's "too proud to fight" just so many weasel words. Some patriotic movie makers shared this sentiment. As a warning, audiences saw America invaded by foreign armies and Americans forced to defend their native soil. J. Stuart Blackton, the head of Vitagraph Studios, collaborated with his good friend Teddy Roosevelt and fashioned the battle cry of peace. This film was full of staged battles which culminated in the final defeat of Washington, D.C. Several movies like this were made, and even newsreel cameramen turned to staging mock battles to feed the growing fear of war. Until the United States entered the conflict, cameras were rarely allowed at the front, and so, presented as actual events, many newsreels were filmed on the picturesque battlefields of New Jersey and California. From early 1915, America was filled with the reports of German espionage in this country. War fear and anti-German sentiment grew. In fact, the nation was keeping a suspicious eye on its foreign population.
If you don't like your Uncle Sammy, then go back to your home or the sea, to the land from where you came, whatever be its name, but don't be ungrateful to me. If you don't like the stars in old glory, if you don't like the red, white, and blue, then don't act like the cur in the story. Don't fight the hand that's feeding you.
By late in the war, American movies carried the spy scare to its logical, if absurd, conclusion. Ironically, the president marched in a preparedness parade the same day that he was nominated at the Democratic Convention of 1916. Wilson campaigned on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Late in 1916, he confided, "Any little German lieutenant can put us into war at any time by some calculated outrage." On April 6, 1917, Congress declared war on the Central Powers of Europe. Gradually, public pressure for unity and patriotism replaced the diversity of pre-war opinions. Pacifistic movies of 1916 gave way to pictures which satirized and condemned pacifism.
Darling,
War resistors and other slackers were ridiculed and shamed into patriotism. A typical situation was this young man's problem, his protective mother who kept him from enlisting.
Have you ever stopped to think of how you sat at mother's knee while she planned your future with you, pictured what a man you'd be, and you threw your arms around her, promised all you'd do someday, the happiness you'd bring to her when she was old and gray. Have you kept your promise to her that you made while on her knees? Can you truly say you're half the man today that she always thought you'd be? Is she proud to be your mother? Is it joy or sorrow in her eyes you see? Are you all she planned and prayed for? All she raked and scraped and slaved for? Are you half the man your mother thought you'd be?
Patriotism in all forms of media became official in September 1917. George Creel was appointed by President Wilson as the director of the newly created Committee on Public Information. The Creel Committee, or CPI, was in fact an official propaganda ministry which heavily influenced and in some cases controlled all public media, including the motion pictures. George Creel called this the world's greatest adventure in advertising, and he quickly realized that the movies were a most useful tool. The CPI began its own film efforts by showing and explaining the draft and the process of mobilization. CPI also endorsed every strip of film that promoted the American war effort. Most CPI-produced films were patriotic newsreels, but more important, the committee formed a mutual agreement with the private film industry. Together, they enforced special distribution laws that dictated to theater owners in all Allied and neutral nations, as well as in the USA, that films like these had to be shown along with the popular Hollywood fare. Not only did this force American propaganda onto movie screens worldwide, but by the end of the war, it gave American films virtual domination of the world film market. The Army Signal Corps produced and distributed many of these newsreels made in the States, and most of those filmed overseas. Army cameras recorded the flow of strength and determination from the streets and training camps of America to the trenches of Europe. Films came in from the field and were processed and passed on to CPI personnel and made into official war review newsreels.
So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there, over there, over there. Send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the drums coming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there.
The Signal Corps staged short dramas to explain government policy as it pertained to both military and civilian life. Soldiers and their families sympathized with this woman and her blinded, though foolish husband, who had failed to take out war risk insurance. Later in the war, the CPI sponsored reenactments of the valorous deeds of American soldiers. As shown by Signal Corps personnel, these dramatizations took considerable liberties with the actual events. In this one, Hunter J. Wickersham of Sugar City, Iowa, captures a German platoon all by himself, despite the fact that he is seriously wounded. Cleaning up a last bit of business after the war, Signal Corps films warned soldiers not to go AWOL before returning to the States for discharge.
But we'll finish Germany, and we'll hang you, Kaiser William, on the highest linden tree.
Film producers soon recognized the profit in patriotism. My 4 years in Germany was Warner Brothers' first picture. And though it was not government funded, it did receive the CPI seal of approval, even though the movie contained much of what Creel had called undesirable propaganda. Rather than glorifying America, it presented a dubious caricature of the enemy, loosely based on the memoirs of James Gerard, American ambassador to Germany before the war. This scene shows a member of the German High Command trying to withhold the ambassador's passport. In return for his freedom, he must agree that America will stay out of the war. The screened version of Gerard echoed the growing American sentiment of 1917. As the war continued, the Creel Committee compromised its ideals by applying pressure that amounted to censorship, while Hollywood freely indulged in presenting negative and horrifying images of the enemy. This stage play, filmed at the end of the war, showed drunken and lecherous Huns overcome by the valiant Yanks. After a frenzy of patriotism and anti-German sentiment, Japanese-American actor Sessue Hayakawa congratulated the audience on its contributions to the successful war effort. In 1918, Banzai had quite a different meaning for Americans. Hayakawa and other movie stars were enlisted to promote the sale of Liberty bonds. 4 Liberty loan drives were mounted, and Americans responded enthusiastically to the call for financing the war effort. Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart, sold the bonds at massive rallies across the nation. Miss Pickford and other stars also made short films promoting the bonds. By 1918, practically every movie theater in the nation included one of these trailers on its program. More than 1/2 of the adult population bought these savings bonds during the 4th drive alone. Lending their screen characters to the war effort, the popularity and influence of Hollywood personalities was so great that it was George Creel's firm opinion that their contribution had helped to win the war. The spirited Douglas Fairbanks leaped and bounded through these short films and rallies. Sale's resistance to handsome and athletic Doug seemed to be small indeed. Without his mustache and tramp costume, Charlie Chaplin spiked the enthusiasm of the crowds at the Liberty Loan rallies. The war was 2.5 years old before the United States joined in. Yet, in his Liberty Loan advertisement, Chaplin reflected the popular sentiment that America alone had KO'd the Kaiser.
When the moon shines bright on Charlie Chaplin, his boots are cracking for want of blacking, and his little baggy trousers they want mending before we send him to the Dardanelles.
In 1917, the governments of France and Britain invited D.W. Griffith to direct films which would excite Allied enthusiasm for the war effort. But when Griffith and a small troupe of actors arrived at the front, they discovered that battles were few and that life in the trenches was tedious and uncertain. Viewed as drama, said Griffith, the war is disappointing. He and his crew soon left France to stage a more interesting and dramatic war on England's Salisbury Plain. The pacifistic Intolerance had been released only slightly over a year before, and in a drastic turnabout, Hearts of the World was the first of Griffith's 3 pro-war propaganda films made during 1917 and 18.
They met while the clouds were hanging over Flanders, a soldier's glance, a war romance. But now he's leaving her alone in Flanders, and he softly whispered to his maid of France, "Don't cry, Frenchy, don't cry, when you kiss me goodbye, I will always keep Lord of dear. You gave to me, dear, so dry your eyes. Sometime, Frenchy, sometime, we'll hear a wedding bell chime. Oh, please don't cry, Frenchy, don't cry, don't cry, until we meet again. Goodbye, goodbye."
Mr. Griffith was decorated by the Treasury Department for his support of the War Savings Stamp Program. Here on the set of another propaganda film, he is congratulated by officials and members of his cast. "Lick the stamps and lick the Kaiser," government posters had proclaimed, and Griffith and Hollywood poured as much enthusiasm into the war effort as they had into their movies. The Heart of Humanity was produced by Universal Pictures in 1918. In this and many other popular films, movie makers portrayed German soldiers as vicious, inhuman brutes, infamous for the kinds of atrocities that become legend during every war. Here they overrun a French village, victimizing the women with their cruelty and depriving starving children of their milk. Cross nurse, that symbol of excellence and humanity, also fell victim to the advances of a decadent enemy. The Heart of Humanity was directed by Alan Holubar as a vehicle for his wife, Dorothy Phillips, though the most memorable actor in the film was Erich von Stroheim. Born in Vienna and supposedly trained in an Austrian military academy, von Stroheim had been military advisor to Griffith on Hearts of the World. In the 1920s, von Stroheim became one of the most distinguished directors in the history of films. But during the war, he built his career on this character of the cruel German officer. Theater marquees and movie posters the world over proclaimed von Stroheim as the man you love to hate. But movie makers didn't always give the Germans and their supposed atrocities such a heavy-handed treatment. Yankee Doodle in Berlin, Max Sennett left behind his Keystone Cops long enough to ridicule every German from the common foot soldier to the Kaiser and his Empress. That lovely woman is actually Bothwell Brown, playing an American spy disguised in feminine togs. He has infiltrated this empire of idiocy and incompetence to steal the German war plans and signal them to the Allies. Even Happy Hooligan, a famous cartoon character, managed to steal the war plans from the Kaiser and return them to Allied headquarters. As a matter of fact, in the movies, everyone seemed to be stealing war plans from the Kaiser. Once obtained, the Allies, led by the Yanks, were over the top, on their way to victory.
The Kaiser will be wiser, and we'll bring him something good, a kimono made of wood. We'll whip him well with shot and shell, the son of a gun we'll give him well, and we're all calling out the Kaiser. Oh, we've got to teach the Kaiser to be wiser. In his palace on the Rhine, we'll hold services at 9. We'll wish him well with shot and shell, the son of a gun we'll give him well. We're all calling out the Kaiser. The English, French, the Yanks, and Irish too. And the world will all rejoice when we plant the devil's choice, for we're all calling out the Kaiser.
There's a temptation to think of the war in terms of battles won, lives lost, and dollars spent. But to look back, other more lasting effects begin to stand out. In fighting and winning the war, we had traded much of that delicate innocence of 1914 for a position of world power and economic domination. Our minds and hearts were not what they had been before the war. We had seen the world and had become too much a part of it to ever again go our separate way. Nothing symbolizes this growth of perspective better than the movies. From the storefront movie houses of 1914 to the grand movie palaces of 1919, in less than 5 years, the American film industry had assumed world domination. For the first time, the image of Americans was widely shown to other peoples of other nations, as we in turn formed our impressions of them in terms of what we saw on our movie screens. The war gave us movies to match the reality of the 20th century. Through them, our view of the world would change in the following decades, and films would even give us our common notions of warfare. For better or worse, the moving picture boys, and all of us, grew up during the Great War.
When I send you a picture of London, then you'll know I've landed safely over there. When I send you a snapshot of Paris, you'll know I'm ready to do and dare. I'll do my share, you'll know I'm thinking about you. When I send you my photo all alone, but when I send you a picture of Berlin, you'll know it's over there, I'm coming home. When I send you a picture of London, then you'll know I've landed safely over there. When I send you a snapshot of Paris, you'll know I'm ready to do and dare. I'll do my share, you know I'm thinking about you. When I send you my photo all alone, but when I send you a picture of Berlin, you'll know it's over there. I'm coming home.
So long for now. This is Lowell Thomas.